All right, good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you all to the 42nd Annual Schumacher Lecture. My name is Matt Stinchcomb, and I am the board chair at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. I thank you all for joining us today. Quick word about the Schumacher Center. It was founded in 1980, and our work is to envision the elements of a just and regenerative global economy, undertake to apply these elements in our home region here in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, and then develop the educational programs to share the results more broadly, thus encouraging replication. We recognize that the environmental and equity crises we now face have their roots in the current economic system. And we believe that a fair and sustainable economy is possible, and that citizens working for the common interest can build systems to achieve it. Our natural commons are best held by the regional community. Money issue can be democratized, ownership should be more diversified, and that labor should have a part in the ownership structure. We favor the face-to-face relationships fostered in local economies, and do wish that we were all gathering in person today, but we deliberately focus on transformative systems and the principles that guide them. To learn more about us, you can visit our website, centerforneweconomics.org. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Natasha Holst, who is a staff member here at the Schumacher Center. She's the program director for the European Land Commons. Natasha's role is to support international and national collaboration for land commons, raising awareness of community land trusts as a proven vehicle to broaden access to land in a fair, place-based, democratic, and voluntary manner. Together with a group of organizations, she recently funded the Dutch land trust, Graan van Bestaan. She was a founding member of Drawdown Europe, focusing on land use in relation to natural climate solutions, and also works with the Biomimicry Institute, focusing on building strategic partnerships and international outreach. Before joining the team at Schumacher, Natasha was the program manager at the Dune Foundation and oversaw the New Economic Program, which provided financial support for initiatives contributing towards fair and sustainable economic systems. She lives in Amsterdam with her husband and 2 children, and thank you for joining us from Europe today, Natasha. Great to see you on video.
It's really my great pleasure to introduce the 42nd Schumacher Lecture by Kate Raworth. As Matt said, I'm talking to you today from just outside Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Kate Raworth is a renegade economist. She focuses on making economics fit for the 21st century realities. She is the creator of the Doughnut of Social and Planetary Boundaries and co-founder of the Doughnut Economic Action Lab. Her internationally best-selling book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, has been translated into over 20 languages and has been widely influential with diverse audiences, from UN General Assembly to Extinction Rebellion. Kate is Senior Associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute, where she teaches on the Masters in Environmental Change and Management. She's also Professor of Practice in my hometown at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Over the past 25 years, Kate's career has taken her from working with micro-entrepreneurs in the villages of Zanzibar to co-authoring the Human Development Report for UNDP in New York, followed by a decade as senior researcher at Oxfam. She holds a first-class BA in Politics, Philosophy and Economics and is an MSc in Economics for Development, both from Oxford University. She has been awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of York, Leuven, and Business School Lausanne. She is also a member of the Club of Rome. I'm proud to say that Amsterdam was the first city to call itself a donut city, and the Amsterdam Doughnut Coalition brings together over 100 local organizations, city government and local initiatives, citizens initiatives, working hard to get the city within the sweet spot so that people can thrive in a thriving place within the planetary boundaries and social thresholds within the donut. This is also where she started to turn the brilliant ideas of the donut into action, what later became DEAL, the Doughnut Economic Action Lab, that now works with cities and regions all over the world, from Cali, Colombia to Brussels, Belgium. Kate Raworth's work stands on the shoulders of great renegade economists of our time, many of whom have given Schumacher lectures in the past 42 years. Kate embodies the spirit of E.F. Schumacher himself, showing that there are exceptions to the well-known saying that anyone who thinks that you can have infinite growth on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. I remember during one of the events that Kate spoke at when her book, Doughnut Economics, first came out in 2017, an older, more traditional economist stood up at the end of her talk, clearly irritated, and said, "Most things that you say in your book have been said before." I will always remember Kate's brilliant rebuttal. "You were right, but obviously nobody was listening, so I thought I would say them again." Kate is a brilliant communicator and has done so much important work communicating these crucial ideas to a broad audience, and also tirelessly works to make economics education fit for the 21st century. With the beautiful visual simplicity of the donut, she has worked with artists and animators and has been able to connect to a broad audience and bring across these vital ideas openly with humor and clarity. Kate Raworth is a 21st century economist and obviously one of the sanest people around. Without further ado, I give you Kate Raworth and the 42nd Schumacher lecture, Planetary Economics, New Tools for Local Transformation.
Thank you so much, Natasha. What a lovely welcome. Yeah, I'm delighted to be standing on the shoulders of giant renegade economists and to be saying things that have definitely been said before, but as nobody was listening, they have to be said again.
Exactly.
So this means a lot to me to be giving this talk this evening. Thank you so much to the Schumacher Center for inviting me. It means a lot to me because it's making me reflect a lot on the shoulders of those renegade giants, on who the work I'm doing builds. It's that sense of being handed ideas generation to generation, and it is our responsibility to bring them into practice. It's also a particularly poignant day for me, and I think for many people who may be in this call, because today is the memorial service to Herman Daly, the founding father of ecological economics, who very sadly passed away just about 2 weeks ago. So I'm really aware of the legacy that's handed to us by our elders, our economic elders and thinkers. And I want to use this opportunity, I'm delighted to use this opportunity to celebrate some of the elders who have hugely influenced me and whose ideas I believe deserve to be center stage in the 21st century economy. So with that, I will share my screen because I want to take you into planetary economics. And we're calling it today Planetary Economics, and how these ideas can be turned into tools for local transformation. So, especially for today, I'm going to begin where I began. My economics journey began on a train. I was on my year off between school and university. I was on holiday with my boyfriend in Italy, and I was reading a textbook. Some of you may even recognize it from what you can see on the screen. This is the Introduction to Positive Economics by Lipsey. I was about to start studying economics at Oxford University. The year was 1990. And I was so excited about studying economics. I was reading the textbook on the train on holiday in Italy with my boyfriend. I was studying economics. Why? Because I had been a teenager of the 1980s. And like every teenager in the 1980s, I saw the news on the TV. And in that news, what I saw was a hole opening up in the ozone layer, a famine in Ethiopia. And I heard the first talk of the greenhouse effect. And these issues, social and environmental, made me, in that brilliantly naive way that many teachers have, many teenagers have and must always have, that way of saying, I want to help change the world. And I believed that learning economics, that mother tongue of public policy, this would give me the tools to help tackle challenges like these. So I bounded off to university, and I was soon disappointed and frustrated because the concepts in Lipsey's book, and indeed in all mainstream economics textbook, do not equip us, I profoundly believe, to transform these challenges. And let me tell you, the first image in almost every single economics textbook in the world, and you can try asking roomfuls of economics students, as I still do today, what's the first diagram you remember learning? And it's always the same. It's supply and demand. That's a very political act. Welcome to economics, the art of household management. Here is the market. Why? Why do we start there? By doing that, we put the market at the center of our vision. We make price the metric of concern. And we find ourselves calling everything that falls outside the price contract an externality, a profound problem to which I will soon return. The portrait of humanity. Who are we? We are told we are rational economic man. And the model that's made of us would look like this if it were actually drawn in the books. He would be a man without caring responsibilities. He's standing alone, independent of others. He's got money in his hand. That's how he interacts with the world. He's got ego in his heart. That's what drives him. He's got a calculator in his head. That's how he knows the answer to everything. And he's got nature at his feet. Nature as his resources. If we carry on telling ourselves that we are like him, and by the way, as we tell ourselves we are like him, we all the more turn into actually being like him. He becomes the model for us. We start to actually value the traits that he caricaturedly tells us we are. We will never learn to thrive and live together as 10 billion human beings on this planet with this as the model of ourselves. And then a third big diagram or concept that comes across in this and all economics textbooks is the idea that the goal, well, it's growth. In fact, we don't even need to talk about it. The goal is growth endlessly. No matter how rich a nation already is, the economists and the politicians will tell you that the solution to its problems lies in yet more growth. I believe these three ideas are profoundly problematic. And the idea that they should equip us to challenge not only the challenges of the 1980s, but now the 21st century is outrageous. And I get very angry very quickly when I think and I know that today's students are still encountering these ideas when they study economics. Now, I had an added problem. I was studying economics in Oxford at Balliol College. And one day I strolled down the street to try and find something wider. And I picked up this book in the local bookshop. And I started reading it. Of course, it was completely different to anything that I was being taught. So it was mind-blowingly exciting. Now, here's my problem, though. My professor was Wilfred Beckerman, who had written the counterpart to Small is Beautiful. He had written a book called Small is Stupid. He had written a book, in fact, I have it here, in defense of economic growth. Now, the first thing I have to say is that Wilfred turned into a great friend in my life. He became a wonderful, lifelong friend, and he so sadly passed away a few years ago, and I miss him. I miss going for walks with him. But my goodness, we had different worldviews. What Wilfred really taught me was to dare to critique. And I know ultimately he did not approve of my critique, of his critique, but we remained firm friends to the end. But of course, what he was teaching me and what the syllabus told him to teach me was so radically different to what Schumacher was offering that I didn't know what to do with it. My solution came, my way forward, and the only thing that really held me to economics came in the second year when I opted to study development economics. And I had the great blessing to be taught by Professor Frances Stewart. And the very first essay that she set for me has really been the question that I've been trying to answer for the rest of my working life. What is the best way of assessing development? And that's literally my first handwritten essay for Frances Stewart, written almost literally 30 years ago to the day. What struck me as so extraordinary was that I had to opt for this rather specialist paper called Development Economics, the Economics of Developing Countries, to be invited to ask what success looked like. Because over there in mainstream economics, over there in the mainstream economics department, well, that's not a question. We've got economic growth. That's what we're oriented towards, and we're not actually going to have a conversation about it. I find it extraordinary that you have to go to a special discipline to actually ask the question. And I realize I have been trying to answer that my whole career, and I've come up with one version of an answer, and it looks like a donut. And of course, I'm going to talk about that more. And I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Frances. And if she's with us right now, thank you, Frances, for steering me with this question through this mire of worldviews, the challenge. And I believe every student today should ask this question: what does success look like? Because only if we start there will we have even half a chance of guiding ourselves well in the 21st century. So let me show you this compass that I came up with many, many years later. In fact, it was 20 years after. In 2012, I first drew this diagram. It's a donut. You don't have to eat donuts. This is the only one that actually turns out to be good for us. It's conceptual. The best ones are. You can think of it as a compass for human prosperity. So if you think of humanity's use of Earth's resources radiating out from the center of this picture, then the hole in the middle is a place where people are left falling short on the essentials of life. It's where people don't have the resources they need for health, education, housing, voice, income, the dignity to participate in society. And this is profoundly inspired by the work of Amartya Sen and his work on human capabilities. It's actually the first book that Frances put in my hand when she was teaching me. Read this. Don't start economics with supply and demand. Start it with human capabilities. What does every person need to lead a life of dignity and participation? So leave no one falling short on these essentials. And how can we express Amartya Sen's concept of human capabilities? Well, I crowdsourced from the world's governments because they have, of course, in the Sustainable Development Goals, together recognized what every human being has a claim to meeting these essentials, these social essentials that enable us all to lead that fundamental of life. So I call it the social foundation. Leave no one in the hole, get everyone out of the hole into the green donut itself. Yes, that's half the story. Because we also know that as we collectively seek to meet our needs and our wants, we start to use Earth's resources, and then we start putting pressure on our planetary home. And let me turn to Fritz Schumacher. One of the quotes you'll find early on in Small is Beautiful: there is overwhelming evidence that the great self-balancing system of nature is becoming increasingly unbalanced. He understood this, he sensed it, he spoke it. He didn't have the metrics, the data at the time. And we've got them now because in 2009, Earth system scientists led by Johan Rockström, Will Steffen, created what they call the planetary boundaries, the 9 life-supporting systems of our planetary home, that self-balancing system of nature, and started to quantify them for the first time. And so that's the outside of the donut, those systems that keep life working on this planet. So put the two together, and we want to leave no one in the hole, but don't overshoot Earth's limits. The aim is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And when I first drew that, people responded so rapidly when we published it as an Oxfam discussion paper. I was fascinated by the power of shapes, by the power of pictures. And I looked to many indigenous cultures and other worldviews and was just immediately struck by how often the symbol in those cultures of well-being, of health, of thriving is a dynamic circle. Somehow dynamism caught within the circle, whether it's the Maori Takarangi, the Enso circle, the Taoist yin yang, the medicine wheel of Turtle Island, the Celtic double spiral, the Buddhist endless knot. It's as if the donut begins to give a Western economic mindset half a chance of moving towards the shape of wisdom that many, many other cultures have long known. And I've begun to think of Doughnut Economics as somehow a Western economic mindset recovery program, because we can't just take a concept, you can't just take Taoism or the medicine wheel. That would be cultural appropriation. The Western mindset needs to find its own way away from its inheritance towards something. How do we learn from these other cultures? And how do we find and express it in our own way? If balance, which the donut shows us, is where we want to get to, we are dangerously out of balance, right? The shape of progress isn't endless growth. It's thriving in that green circle, but we are massively out of balance, as the red in this diagram shows. Billions of people falling short on the essentials of life, and we are overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. Now here, and as I went back and looked again at Small is Beautiful, I found really interesting different approaches. Of course, Schumacher is very well known for this quote: the aim should be to obtain the maximum of well-being with the minimum of consumption. And indeed, if we were doing this, we would be thriving in the donut. There would be no red here at all. But the donut itself aims, I would say, for something complementary but slightly different. The donut's aim is to ensure that everybody can fulfill at least the minimum of their essential needs, leave no one in that hole. And we must do that within a maximum of pressure on the planet. So it's coming from a different place. It's coming from a place of saying, look how violated people's rights are. Look how degraded the living planet is. Rather than aiming right now for the optimum, let's ensure that whatever developmental steps are next taken, we at least prioritize meeting the needs of all. And we start coming back within the means of the living planet. So it's a minimal justice basis. We can see the degradation, the injustice in the headlines of the newspapers, whether it's on the climate crisis, whether it's on pollution and plastics, phosphorus, water shortages, land degradation, destruction of other life on Earth, toxic air. I love this quote from NASA, however, hole in Earth's ozone layer finally closing up because humans did something about it. And that's the point. We can do something about all of this. Indeed, in the words of the American writer Edward S. Burroughs, after taking one look at this planet, any visitor from outer space would say, I want to see the manager. We want to see the manager, not only for the ecological degradation, but for the human impact. Water and energy shortages are fueling a global food crisis. And the stat that I find hardest to actually comprehend, the richest 1% of people own half the world's wealth. I'll say that again. The richest 1% of people on the planet own over half of the world's wealth. There is no chance of getting into the donut with these dynamics. This is a world that's profoundly degraded, running down the living planet. This is a world that's profoundly unequal. We have to turn this story around. And I'd say that this story, the headlines, the image of the donut, this is our state of knowledge of humanity in the living world. And I believe it's what our children and their children will judge us for. What did you do once that you knew? Once you'd seen this picture and you can't unsee it? Because last century's theories and government policies and business models and lifestyles, none of them were designed to solve this. So we need new theories, new government policies, new business models. We need new lifestyles to turn around this story. What I'm showing you is the donut at the global scale, but of course, a lot of action and policy making happens at a national or more local scale. So let's go to the national. My brilliant colleague, Andrew Fanning and Dan O'Neill and others created these national donuts. So we can see, for example, Malawi on around $1,500 per person per year. Massive human shortfall, not overshooting their share of the pressure on the planet. You've got China with that double whammy of both human shortfall and overshoot. At the end, you've got the United States. Strong inequality, that's the red wedge on the inside, the inequality, which of course causes deprivation for many, and massive ecological overshoot. And the reason I'm showing Denmark today, and I could have shown you Sweden or Norway or Finland, because people think, oh, but those Scandinavians, they've got it sorted, haven't they? I mean, they are really ecologically sound. No, they're not. No, they're not. No, they may have clean air and clean water and forests, but their global footprint, their consumption footprint is overshooting planetary boundaries, just like every other high-income country. So I throw a challenge to everybody. Next time you find yourself talking about developed countries, I ask you, where are you talking about? Because there is absolutely nothing developed about overshooting planetary boundaries. So I can't think of a single nation in the world that has a right to say we're a developed country. We're all developing on a transformative journey. Let me make that really clear. Here's a diagram of over 50 national donuts. Now, the goal is to be in that sweet spot in the top left-hand corner, to meet the needs of all people and come back within the means of the living planet. First of all, you can see there is no country that's there. And the nearest country, it's Costa Rica, nearly meeting the needs of its people, closer than any other country to being within the means of the living planet. What can we learn from Costa Rica? See at the bottom there, you've got Uganda, Niger, Kenya, Malawi, Bangladesh. How can these countries meet the needs of their people without overshooting the planetary boundaries in the way that every country before them has done? It's an unprecedented journey. How can middle-income countries like China, Turkey, Bolivia, Russia, South Africa, both meet people's needs and already come back within those planetary boundaries? That's never been done before. And then the high income countries. Hello, United States, Canada, and Australia, the big red ones, throbbing red sticking out there at the side. Sweden, Norway, the UK, Germany, Netherlands, any high income you like needs to come right back within. That's never been done before. We don't yet know how we're going to do this. So every country here should have an unprecedented level of humility and ambition. And let's recognize that although they stand as separate dots on the page here, all of these nations are profoundly interconnected by histories of colonialism, by military power and corporate power, by trade and finance rules, by resource extraction, and by the present and future impacts of climate change. These impacts, of course, hitting predominantly from the global north to the global south. So we need to transform within countries and between. How on earth do we do this? We need new economic ideas. And it was actually this urgent need for new ideas, having drawn the donut, having seen the impact that it was having and traction with people in the world, it led me to say, so what kind of ideas would actually help us get there? And this is actually where I owe my biggest debt to Fritz Schumacher. Everybody has their favorite quote from Small is Beautiful or from his writings. I think the one I jumped out to me and it set me off on a path is in a bit of an unusual one. What matters, he said, is the toolbox of ideas through which we experience, interpret the world. And I remember I was sitting in a cafe in Brussels reading his book at the time, and in the midst of all of his ideas, when this sentence jumped out to me, it gave me such a feeling of permission to start gathering ideas for that toolbox, to push aside the textbooks and the logical consequences of all that's gone before and ask, what ideas would you want to actually source and find and create now and put in your toolbox? So I'm a very visual person. So I literally got a picture of a toolbox. This was it. I got a picture of a toolbox and I photoshopped inside it the donut. And this became the way I wrote my book. I had a big PowerPoint file. It was called Toolbox of Ideas, Keep Adding. That's the name of the PowerPoint file. I've still got it. And I just started gathering ideas, and almost all of them were visual pictures that excited me, that reframed the fundamentals of the world, whether they were about feminist economics or the second law of thermodynamics or systems thinking or planetary boundaries or a circular economy or distributed design or the logistic growth curve that doesn't grow endlessly but grows up, or resilience thinking. And these ultimately led me to start thinking, what are the big principles I want to draw out? This was me thinking along the way, and it ended up being 7 ways to think, 7 old diagrams and 7 new diagrams. And this was published as Doughnut Economics, the book, in 2017. So I'm just saying this to celebrate. Thank you, Fritz Schumacher, because it was literally this quote and this idea of assemble your toolbox. The 21st century student deserves something new. This is what excited me and inspired me. It made me feel free and permitted to just gather ideas from feminist economics and complexity and ecological economics and institutional economics and behavioral economics, and see what happens when they all dance on the same page. And I was thrilled by what I found. This was the economics I hadn't been taught, and it was so exciting, and that's what compelled me. And I believe these ideas and many others should be the starting point for 21st century economics that should already be being exactly what's taught on the curriculum, and still yet isn't. So let me take you into some of this story. What's the first diagram? If you've introduced the donut as a goal, here's one goal among many other cultural goals. Here's a goal. We want to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. We can debate that goal. That's great. We're having a conversation, but let's say we just take it as the goal for now. Okay. What would be the first diagram representation of the economy that you bring? I would never, ever start with supply and demand. I start with this diagram, and I call it the embedded economy diagram. It's, as Natasha introduced, it's built on the shoulders and on the ideas of many others. If you know of ecological economics, feminist economics, and commons thinking, they're right here. So it's an economy that's embedded in society, because the economy is a social construct. We invented it, we can reinvent it. And human society is embedded in the rest of nature, because we are a part of nature in the living world. And that move of placing humanity and society in the living world, a big debt to Herman Daly, to Robin Wall Kimmerer, Janine Benyus. These 3 writers massively inspired me. And today I'm going to just lean into talking more about Herman Daly, because he has so recently left us in this world. And I feel the legacy of his ideas so strongly. So Here's the problem that Herman Daly encountered. It still is the problem we face. This is the way mainstream economics represents, or it literally fails to represent, the living world. In microeconomics, well, it shows up when you have your supply and demand, and then there's a gap between the private marginal cost and the social marginal cost, and we create this little gray triangle wedge. That's the living world. If you ask a mainstream economist, tell me how you talk about the death of the planet, how you talk about the hole in the ozone layer, climate breakdown, ecological collapse. They say, yes, it's an environmental externality. There it is. It's that gray wedge. I mean, I swear, if an alien from outer space, if aliens wanted to take us down, they don't need to invade. They would just show us, oh, humans, this is a really good way to represent your planetary home. Like this will serve you, because they know that we have absolutely no chance of protecting the living planet on which we depend, of which we're part, if we're going to show it in economics as a shaded gray wedge. So that's the micro. And the macro, it doesn't even show up at all. Macroeconomics' main diagram of the circular flow of income and goods. If you really want to try and make the living world visible, you say, well, it's a form of capital, right? You've got labor and capital provided by households to business. In return, they get wages and profit. Okay, let's call the living world a kind of capitalist land. So all of life, all of the delicacy and complexity of the world is bound up in capital, and let's call it a form of land. We are giving ourselves no chance of protecting the only known living planet in the universe if we carry on like this. These aliens, they're laughing. They're laughing all the way to the Intergalactic Council, because we are completely going to fail. So Herman Daly was having none of this. Herman Daly was working at the World Bank, and he recognized that you have to see the economy as a subsystem of the living world. It's a wholly owned subsidiary, he said, of the living world. And the economy is an open system, right? It's drawing in matter and energy, and it's putting out waste matter and waste energy. That's those arrows going through. So it's within the living world, which is a closed system, because it's closed to energy. It's closed to matter. There's just energy coming in, thank goodness, from the sun, and waste heat going out. And Herman Daly brilliantly said, well, maybe once we could have imagined that we lived in an empty world. There was so much sky, so much sea, so many fish in the sea, timber in the forests. We could just puff out our carbon emissions and it would just go up into the cloud. The atmosphere is so big, and we couldn't possibly disrupt. We could kind of treat it as out there. We could leave it blank. But we don't live in empty world. We live in full world. We live in full world where the economy is bumping up against the edges of the ecosystem. It's the point of pressure. It's the point of scarcity. And when it's not labor that's scarce, but the living world that's scarce, when it's not resources, but nature's capacities, then your priorities change, don't they? And this, to me, when I first saw this diagram, it completely changed my worldview. And it taught me the power of pictures. As Donella Meadows would say, pictures can change our paradigms in a blink of an eye. And of course, what turns out to be the case is not that we are delicately touching up against the edges of the planet. As the planetary boundary scientists came along decades later and said, actually, we are massively overshooting our pressure on the planet and at risk of serious breakdown and irreversible decline. So thank you, Herman Daly, for bringing this in. And that's why I would always start by showing any student of economics that economy is embedded in the living world. But let's dive inside the economy and let's recognize that there are many different ways we provision for our wants and needs. Yes, there's the market. There's also the state with public services. So let's begin with the market and think about our own identities. We can be a consumer or a producer. In the space of production, you might be a capital owner earning a rent, or labor earning a wage. Or you may be indeed excluded from the market and destitute. Now, it was Karl Marx who teaches us never to forget the distinction that matters between whether you own capital or you earn a wage. And this is all the power in market relations. When mainstream economics starts with markets, they don't usually start with Karl Marx, but let's do that today. Starts with markets and says, well, sometimes the market may fail and therefore you might want the state. Now, in relation to the state, we could be a public servant, a teacher, a doctor, a regulator, a civil servant. You could be a resident of a place, a voter and a protester, or you could be stateless, excluded from that state relation, excluded from recognition and access to public services. And two people who I think have done a really great rebalancing of this market state boxing match of the last 50 years are Mariana Mazzucato, whose work on recognizing that the state can actually be entrepreneurial and Ha-Joon Chang, born in Korea when it was called a third world nation, watching his home country use the state, use public regulation, use trade policies to actually become one of the richest countries in the world. He tells a very different story about the role of the state in industrial policy and in a nation's development. So we've got the market and the state. And of course, these two show up in GDP. That's what national income accounting measures when it shows the output of an economy. But across this horizontal, we are missing two massive other ways that we provision for our needs and wants every single day. Let's go to the household, where you may be a parent, a partner, a relative, a child, engaged in all that unpaid care work of cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, raising the kids, doing it all again tomorrow, getting labor fresh and ready for work to show up at the factory door. Or you may be kinless, excluded from that family relation. And many feminist economists, such as Nancy Folbray, Diane Elson, Peggy Antrobus, have made that unpaid care work and its essentiality so central to the economic story. How can it ever be left out? Because it's an utter subsidy to the productive paid economy, the reproductive unpaid care work, the core economy, as many people are now calling it. But also let's recognize the commons, where people meet not through the market or the state, but as a community, and co-create goods and services that they value, sometimes with no money changing hands. You may be a co-creator, a sharer, a repairer, a steward, or you may be excluded from the commons. And this, of course, is the space of Eleanor Ostrom, who didn't, like Garrett Hardin, just declare the tragedy of the commons and generalize about it. She said, well, that's funny, because actually there are a few places in the world that seem to be working. So I'm actually going to go there and research and find out how they're doing it. And turns out the commons can sometimes be a triumph, not just a tragedy. And of course, she came up with the core design principles of how commoners need to collaborate. And then let's lastly look at finance sector. You may be a creditor or a debtor, an investor, a trader, or a financial excluded. And this, of course, is an area I believe needs massive rethinking and retheorizing. Money, the design of money and its role. Two people who've definitely influenced me are Stephanie Kelton, bringing back what's now known as modern monetary theory, and Bernard Lietaer, looking at the deep design of money itself and how it profoundly shapes our relationships and our actions and inequalities in society. So that's my detour into the designs and these different traits of the common market. And of course, let's ask ourselves, what happens when we now add in context of power, context of crisis? What's going to happen? What is happening in these contexts? Because these relationships look very benign, but actually markets in context of power and crisis, we see market capturers and rent seekers becoming dominant. The state can become corrupt or the oppressor. In the financial markets, the speculator and the hoarder. In the household, the patriarch and the exploiter. And in the commons, the encloser and the extractor. How do we ensure that as we are in this era, many people will recognize as an era of crisis, permacrisis, polycrisis, that these red highlighted roles don't become the norm? Because of course, there's always power at play in our economies. How can we design our economies, and how can we teach our economic students to take care that we don't end up with economies that only perform in these exploitative and power-based ways, that we actually protect the commons, we value the household, we make markets in service, finance in service, and we protect and reinvest in the public good. So a starting point, as you can tell, would be a very rich base and starting point for many, many conversations about the economy and how it works in its many interactions. So let me pull back and say, here's the donut, here's where we are. This is a world, as the red shows us, of extreme social shortfall. This is a world that's deeply unequal, and it's a world that's deeply degraded, running down the living planet. How do we turn this story around with that richer starting point of what the economy is? I believe there are two dynamics we fundamentally need to change. We need to become distributive and regenerative by design. So let me speak a little what I mean about each of those. If we want to change the future, we need to change the dynamics that are driving the direction of the economy. And we've inherited linear, degenerative industrial systems that take Earth's materials, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while and throw it away. And this is pushing us over planetary boundaries every single day. We need to become regenerative, circular, cyclical by design, so that we don't use resources up, we use them again and again, so that we come to work within the cycles and the living world. We work with Earth's cycles, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nutrient cycle. We work with the capacity of Earth to generate resources and the capacity of her sinks to absorb our wastes. totally different kind of economy. What would it look like? We can only begin to get glimpses of its possibility, from land degradation to land restoration, nature coming back, from industrial systems that throw our waste in the neighborhoods of the world's poorest people, to industries that are designed to repair and reuse and refurbish and repurpose and share. Completely different business models needed to make this happen. From cities with 10-lane highways that are replaced by a river and a park. This isn't Photoshop, this is real. This is in the city of Seoul. From hospitals, imagine if you were ill and you needed to be in the hospital, which hospital would you rather be in? This one in the UK where there's not a single living thing in sight, or this one in Singapore, surrounded by, embedded in the nature of the place? We know that humans heal faster when we feel and see nature around us. How do we bring nature back into our cities? So from degenerative to regenerative design, but that's just one of two dynamics. The second, we have inherited economies that through regulation, through the code of capital, through privilege, through networks, through success to the successful, they drive value and opportunity into the hands of a few. And we see the rise of a 1% in many economies, in many countries and globally, and COVID has supercharged that. We need to create economies that are distributive by design, so that value and opportunity that's created is shared with all who co-create it. And what would that look like? Thinking of places, I grew up in London, a city that, like many high-income cities and middle-income cities, have housing and rent crisis, because housing is treated as an investment and speculative asset. And the majority of people are left desperately trying to pay the rent that's extracted by the landlord. The city of Vienna, however, almost 100 years ago, decided that housing is a human right and decided to own the housing in the city in a way that respects that. So over 60% of people in Vienna live in housing that's social housing. It's owned by the city or city-run co-ops. It's central, it's affordable, it's normal. That's because they made the choice to make housing a human right, to make it distributive by design. What about business itself? Why should business be profit-driven? That's a very 20th century norm. It's so ingrained in the business model and the legal fiduciary duty, we think it's just the only way business can be. It isn't. We can have business that's actually purpose-led, like this craft company in Mumbai, where the workers own the factory, where companies pay a profit share, they're cooperatives, they're employee-owned. There are so many ways we can redesign business to make it far more distributive by design. And of course, when these ideas come together, and they can come together in places like cities and in nations, how do we create infrastructures, economies, markets, public goods that are distributive and regenerative by design? They together start to bring us into the donut from both sides. So these are some of the ideas from Doughnut Economics. And what I really want to do now is to say, okay, ideas on the page, very nice. Let's get into practice. How do we do that? And we've been working at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, which I set up after my book came out. And so many people said, and we're doing this, we want to do this. Let's create an action lab to do it. We've been working a lot with cities and towns and neighborhoods and communities and regions and districts. And I'll talk you through how we actually turn this into a practical tool. So many people, ever since I drew the donut in 2012, cities and councillors and mayors started getting in touch and say, how can our city live in the donut? How can we help bring humanity in there? So we've created a tool. We unroll the donut, open that space out, because we need to go inside. We need to create space for ourselves between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling. And we can actually use it as a canvas, as an exploratory space for imagining the future we want. Now, here's the spoiler alert. Doughnut does not tell you the answers. I mean, it would be absurd if it did. If it had an answer for Dhaka and Dar es Salaam and Dubai and Dundee, totally different places in the world. The answers come locally, from local possibilities, local values, local cultural and ecological context. And let me show you how. We invite every place to ask itself this question. And I invite you, wherever you are right now, your city, your town, your home, your village, how can our place become a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? Yes, that's a big question. Let's break it down into parts. We break this into what we call the 4 lenses. We look at the local aspirations of a place. It's a great life here, but that must be done in the context of its global responsibilities, recognizing that we're all interconnected with people worldwide. So 4 lenses. First, how can all the people of our city thrive? What would it mean for everybody here to meet those essentials of health and education, housing, food, transport, culture, voice, income. These are from the Sustainable Development Goals. The way this question is going to be answered is different in Dar es Salaam and in Dubai and in Dundee, because it's a different culture, it's different people, it's a different values. And that's the beauty of making it a local question with local answers. And also on the local ecological question, how can our city be as generous as the wildland next door? This is inspired by the brilliant biomimicry thinker, Janine Benyus. If Janine were here with us, she'd say, well, wherever you are right now, go to the wildland next door, go to the nearest healthy natural habitat of your place, because in every place, nature has a genius. She's figured out how to thrive there. She knows how to sequester carbon where you are, how to store groundwater after a storm, how to cleanse the air, how to house biodiversity, how to regulate the temperature from the treetops to the forest floors. She knows how to make us feel at home. She continually recreates the conditions conducive to life. So wherever you are, nature's generosity becomes our ecological performance standard for our city. Now, can your city aim to sequester as much carbon as nature does? At the moment, our cities release carbon. Flip that around. How do we sequester carbon? How do we store water instead of having stormwater runoffs? How do we cool the temperature and instead of having urban heat island effects? How do we make people feel at home instead of making feel urban alienation? Beautiful questions. Again, unique answers to every place. How do our cities and settlements become settled and nestled within nature's ecosystems? So these are the local aspirations. Now, we've got to put them in the context of global responsibilities, because if you think of just today, all the clothes you're wearing, the food you've eaten, the electronics we're all using right now, the construction materials that built our homes, the consumer goods, they have come from all over the world. And so we have a global footprint of carbon, of materials, of fertilizer, land use, water use, minerals. So we have to ask, how can our city respect the health of the whole planet? We need to come back within that red overshoot of planetary boundaries and reduce and reuse and create a circular economy that enables us to thrive here. And still thinking of all those global supply chains that we're connected to, how can our city respect the health and the well-being of people worldwide? Who made our clothes? Who packed our food? Who dug the materials that became our walls? Who assembled your phone and your laptop? Global labor rights and supply chains. Who's impacted today? Is it in Pakistan? Is it in Nigeria? Who's impacted today by floods, by droughts, by climate extremes of our lifestyles? And how does our place welcome refugees and migrants when they arrive? What's the official welcome? What's the feel of welcome? How do we relate to and build solidarity with others? So these are the four lenses. And as you can see, the answers will be unique to each place. Now, we started using this tool in Portland, in Philadelphia, and in Amsterdam, where Natasha is. In 2009, you can see this is before COVID. And these are policymakers in the city and community members. And what they said in these workshops is, it's such a relief to be together working with a holistic framework that lifts us out of our silos, not just transport strategy or climate strategy or water strategy or social inclusion strategy. It's all here together. Let me tell you some stories of places that have adopted the tools. So Amsterdam, as Natasha said, was the first city to create its portrait through the four lenses of the donut and launch it in April 2020. That was the height of the city's COVID crisis. And they put it on a Dutch orange donut, and they said, our goal as a city is to be a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all residents while respecting the planetary boundaries. They put this concept at the top of their circularity strategy with a commitment to being 50% circular by 2030. That's a tall order. And 100% circular by 2050. And started going on housing, on textiles, on food. And we know that Amsterdam, when Amsterdam began, this kicked off amazing peer-to-peer inspiration with other cities. Within 6 weeks, the city of Copenhagen had a massive majority vote in the council to say, we too want to explore the donut. And it started kicking off all over. Crucial also in Amsterdam was the Amsterdam Doughnut Coalition, as Natasha mentioned, a network of civic organizations that said, well, hang on, we're doing many, many different things, but they all contribute to bringing humanity into the donut. We're going to create the Doughnut Coalition here and celebrate the pioneers and recognize that what's already in action is taking us in this direction. And I think in Amsterdam, it's been particularly powerful having both the city council and this civic network holding each other to account, pushing each other along. So it's the government and the civil society together making that progress. In Leeds, the civic organization together with the council took on the concept. They created their own donut. You can see it here. They re-rolled it. This is the Leeds donut. This is our vision towards Leeds in 2030, a low carbon, safe, inclusive place for all, using it in a very playful way of involving a community conversation. In Barcelona, the city council, again, they've adopted it and they are doing a data analysis. You can see those 4 lenses spread out along the unrolled donut, but also holding events in the park, inviting citizens and community members to tell how they are experiencing the city of Barcelona, what's their vision for the way they want the place to become. And in Bhutan, the government said, actually, we think there's a real connection here between gross national happiness, our concept, and the donut. We can see that connection. And we want to explore and use the donut as a concept for the plan of Thimphu and Paro, the major city regions in the country. If you want to bring this right down to the community level, amazing community work is happening in the city of Birmingham, led by an organization called Civic Square, who within literally the neighborhood of Ladywood, taken the concept with full integrity right down to the street level and say, how can we do street retrofits? How can we create dreamers and recognize that everybody here can be an economist in the way that we shop and buy and consume and invest and divest and protest? We are all economists in action. Incredible work they're doing. In fact, there's over 40 governments worldwide, and you can see many of them mentioned here on this slide, already using the donut as a tool in their cities and regions, and many, many more community groups in action. What we found, all of these groups come back and say, if we're going to transform, we need to transform our own institutions. We need to look at the deep design of our places, because many mayors and councillors started saying, you know, we were told, sort of inherited from the 1980s, that the idea of a successful city was to say, how do we make our city grow? City GDP needs to be rising, and that's success. We don't want to aim for that. That's not what we think success is. We want to thrive. This donut actually makes a lot more sense to the goals we already hold. How can we be a place that thrives? Now, what is it that leaves one city aiming still to grow and another pursuing that thriving? And we think there are 5 deep design traits, which we've borrowed from the brilliant analyst Marjorie Kelly. A place's purpose, networks, governance, ownership, and finance. In these last few minutes, I'm going to share this last idea. So what is the purpose of your place? What's your vision of the city or the town or the community you want to become? Is it shared? Have you got the metrics to know whether or not you'll be getting there? Is it ambitious enough for the times we live in? What about networks? All the relationships that your city council should hold. Amplify the voice of civic networks, connect with other cities and learn from that peer-to-peer inspiration, bring in change makers and enable their pioneering work to become the new normal. How is the city governed? How do you use experiments to pilot and then scale up what's working? How do you promote deliberative democracy and citizens' voices? And how do you get your people out of those silos that they so desperately want to get out of and work collaboratively? Let's go deeper. How is the city owned? How are the key sources of wealth in your place owned? What about public services? And what's the power of bringing those back? Paris, for example, privatized water in the 1980s, realized that it was not only losing the revenue from the water services, but massively losing control of the water supply. It's brought it back under public control to recognize the value of controlling core assets. Supporting community-owned and managed projects, community land trusts. How can a city or a place make that possible? Bring back the commons and enable spaces for commoners to thrive. How can we use public land to accelerate change, to create an energy revolution? And then let's go deepest, and it's always at the bottom, it's finance, and it lies deepest. How can we transform finance so it's in service to our cities, in service to the places we live in and our economies, whether it's through participatory budgeting, through divesting pensions, and through community wealth building and anchor institutions that use the resources we have to procure from small enterprises that are already exemplifying the future we want to make normal. So these 5 design traits, and we put them on a canvas and we say, of course, you're not in control of everything, because every city is embedded in a nation, embedded in a region, embedded in the world. You don't control all the legislation that has shaped your city, and we're all part of a global financial capital system. So let's just recognize where we're being held back and where we can already move forward, and then ask, what can we stop doing because we have the power? What can we start doing because we have the power? And indeed, we've had these conversations from Amsterdam to Ipoh in Malaysia, Toronto and Barcelona, city policymakers really exploring the power relations and where transformation can begin. So I'm going to pull right back. We began with the ideas that I encountered in my very 20th century economics book called Positive Economics. There was actually nothing positive about it. It was neither value neutral nor optimistic and useful to me. So I'm sorry, David Lipsey, but Positive Economics is out. We need a 21st century starting point for the ideas that today's students, I'm in the city of Oxford, what are these students in Oxford University learning? What are they learning in Stanford and Harvard and MIT? What are they learning in Cambridge? We're in Beijing, in India. What are students around the world being taught? These are the policymakers of 2050. These are the people who are going to steer the whole of humanity through this century. What ideas should be in their minds? It's not these ones. And I get that. I'm getting angry again. It's a travesty. It's an outrage that they are still taught this starting point because it is no way equipping them, and they know it. They deserve to begin with ideas that are informed by people like Fritz Schumacher, Herman Daly, Donella Meadows, Eleanor Ostrom, Amartya Sen, and many, many others who I've shared their ideas today. Start with a goal. Meet the needs of all within the means of the living planet. Recognize that we are social adaptive humans dependent upon one another. Recognize the economy is embedded in society and the living world, that we need to become regenerative and distributive by design, and that we need tools, accessible, playful tools that means nobody is left feeling intimidated by economics, because we all should be part of this conversation. And here's my last thought. How long is it going to take until this is just normal? I mean, Schumacher wrote Small is Beautiful in 1973. Herman Daly wrote his most core ideas in the 1970s. Limits to Growth was written in the 1970s. I was born, I'm 51 years old, I'm almost 52. So I'm a baby of 1970. I'm the child who they probably hoped their ideas would be taught to me and others like me when we hit school. No, because it's still not happening. It's still on the fringes. The mainstream curriculum still doesn't do this. And actually, as I reread Small is Beautiful, I found this quote from Schumacher. He said, the third or fourth generation, that normally is the time it takes from the birth of an idea to its full maturity, when it fills the minds of a new generation and makes them think by it. And it's time. It's time for these ideas to be presented to students, because one thing I do know is that when students encounter these, they say this is my starting point. This is what I want to learn. And they actually start to rise up and rebel against the textbooks and the mainstream curriculum. The Rethinking Economics movement internationally is leading this work. And any young students, I absolutely encourage you, and teachers encourage you to be part of that network and take it forward. So let me finish by saying that we founded Doughnut Economics Action Lab because when people read Doughnut Economics, they started getting crazy and playful and using it, turning it into glasses and a tablecloth and a design of a city plan and teaching it in classrooms. So we knew that these people wanted to come together and we would learn together. We founded Deal to bring together any change makers who want to be part of it. We've now got over 10,000 members of our website, and I invite every single person here to join, or you can just browse. You can use the tools. They're in the commons. We're part of the 21st Century Commons. So we put our tools in there for free, but they're commons. So we ask reciprocity in return. If you use them, share back what you learned, share back your innovations, because we know that is incredibly inspirational and powerful to the very next change maker. And the tools I shared today, we call it Doughnut Unrolled. If you want to explore them for your place, these will be the tools to go for. Take a look. I very much hope you use these tools, and let's do justice to the legacy of Schumacher, of Herman Daly, of all those whose ideas have long been waiting to be put into practice. It's time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate, for sharing your lecture with us. We've been collecting some really great questions from the audience, and we'll be sharing some of them with you. We are both members of the Schumacher Center board. My name's Alice Maggio.
My name's Agatha Basilar.
And we've been coming up with some questions for you. So I think Agatha has our first question.
So to start with the donut that you presented and came up with, well, first of all, your book was written in 2017. You gave a TED Talk in 2018. Now it's 2022. So it's really neat to see the journey and how that idea has been spreading. And there's many people in the audience who would like to apply your donut to their own communities.
Great.
So first of all, there was a question on granularity. So in the inner circle of the social foundation, there seems to be a bar graph that's split in two for each item. Why is it split in two? And how would you encourage someone to make a donut for their own community? And how long does this process normally take? What's involved?
Oh, great question. Okay, why is it split in two? Yes, here we are. Here's the donut. So some of these, like here's food, there's only one bar, right? And that's the number of people in the world who don't have enough food to eat every day. So that's the caloric shortfall. Now, some of them have two. Let me go to, say, energy, right? It's split. The reason there are two, because if you think about it, when I was doing this, I was thinking, okay, how do we show visually, very simply in a snapshot, the status of people, the number of people in the world who don't have access to clean energy services? Now, of course, if you start looking at data, there's a lot of different metrics. And my challenge I set to myself is, can I show it with just one or two? So for energy, we've got the percentage of people who don't have access to electricity. And then we've got the percentage of people, and that's, I think, 13%. And then we've got the percentage of people who don't have access to clean cooking sources. So they're cooking over fires and breathing in polluting smoke or coal from wood or charcoal. And instead, we want them to have everyone to have access to cooking facilities that don't destroy the lungs of women and children. So it's two metrics here. And so on health, there might be two different indicators. So that's the reason for the step. And it segues very nicely into the second part of the question. How can you do this in your local community? As I showed, the Doughnut Unrolled tools goes into much more detail and invites you then, let's say we were saying, okay, let's look at access to health in your local community. It then becomes a community question. Well, one, what's our target here? And often city councils or town councils have got a target. Everybody here should have access to good health services and lead a healthy life, no matter their background or income. Cities have targets like this. So, okay, well, the city already had a target. Shall we ask ourselves, is it good enough? Do we want to improve our target? This is an opportunity to set our sights higher. And two, how would we know if we're meeting it? So what data do we have in our city about the people's health status? And what kinds of metrics could we find? Now, some cities have great sources of data. There are other places, people have used this, for example, in Uganda. They said, well, we've got almost no data. So they've started by taking photographs or collecting stories, or what other ways can we gather data here if it's not all recorded? So it can become an amazing community project. And I'm actually very excited about the idea of schools taking this on as a project, either for their school, let's look at our school community, or for their school in their town and their neighborhood. And how can we turn this into a project where we gather the data? How long does it take? Well, it can take as long as you like. Some in the city of Leeds, and I showed the one from Leeds, a brilliant academic at the University of Leeds called Paul Chatterton, had 4 master's degree students who were looking to do a dissertation. And so each of them took one of those 4 lenses. And as their dissertation, they gathered the city of Leeds's targets that they had, and they gathered the best available data. And together, those 4 dissertations created the basis of the Leeds Doughnut. So that's one way. In Ladywood in Birmingham, that community-led portrait, they did it over, I'd say, 3 or 4 months as a community initiative, engaging and inviting people to get involved in citizen-led science. And the city of Barcelona are probably doing it over about 6 months. So of course, it depends on how much depth you want to go, how many people are involved, and you can see it as a one-off. Well, if you create that portrait, then it becomes like a baseline. Okay, we can use this over time to measure how we're doing, how we're improving. But all of this information and many examples of different ways of getting started are in those tools that I shared. So I'd really encourage anybody to go on Deal's website and look for the Doughnut Unrolled tools.
So for those tools, I saw that you have some that are meant for cities or communities, and then you also have some that are built for businesses to think about their own business and how they might transform. And for both cases, I was wondering if you see certain aspects of those tools or steps of the process where people often stumble, or where, you know, it's really hard to get over assumptions that we have. And if you see that, and then how do people overcome those stumbling blocks? I know
Great.
that
So
you talk about the networks, governance,
yes,
financing, and I was kind of thinking about those specifically.
exactly. So let me just say that on businesses, we have been really careful around business, because just as when I first drew the donut in 2012, cities and towns said, we want to do the donut, businesses came too. Oh, we want to be a donut business. And my hackles immediately went up, and I thought, well, this is going to get co-opted pretty quick. So when we found a deal, we said, sorry, no, please don't use it, businesses. Don't use it publicly. You can't use this. It's in the commons, but we're going to protect it. It's not a free-for-all, as Ellen Ostros taught us. The commons are not a free-for-all. There are rules that we follow as commoners. And so first we said, you cannot use it as a business until we're ready, because otherwise business will eat us for breakfast. That's what it likes to do. Take a concept, co-opt it, water it down, greenwash it, and then it's degraded for everybody. So we've just this past week, so it's great timing, this past week, launched our tools for business, Doughnut Design for Businesses. It's again another tool, a different tool on our website. And it invites every company to look at itself. How is it pushing humanity out of the donut? That's the way business actually was traditionally profitable. How is a company helping bring humanity in the donut? How could it become regenerative and distributive by design? Radical ideas. And we invite companies to imagine transformative ideas to become regenerative and distributive. And as you just suggested, we say to every company, look, we don't particularly need to talk about the design of your products. I mean, that's ultimately what's going to change and what consumers are going to see different, but that's not where we want to end up. We don't want to end up talking about the design of your products. We want to talk about the design of your company. And guess what? It's around these Save 5 design traits. And this, Marjorie Kelly really actually drew this up, first of all, around the design of enterprise. So what's your purpose as a company? Why do you exist in the world? How do you network with your suppliers, your customers, your staff, your community, your industry allies? How are you governed? Who has voice on the board? What are your metrics of success? How is this company owned? Because whether it's owned by its employees, by its founding entrepreneur, by shareholders, by venture capital, by the state, by a cooperative, by a founding family, well, that's going to have huge implications for how it's financed, where that money is coming from, what that money is expecting and demanding, and whether essentially this company is ultimately really in service of finance, or finance and all of its design is in service of its purpose. And I think there's really interesting examples. I'll just say one, Patagonia, right? And I'm mentioning it not because it's the world's most perfect company, because it's a big company that many, many people have heard of, and they did something pretty impressive recently. They transformed their ownership from being owned by the family to a steward ownership company. Now they have the voting rights are held in one trust, and the spending rights, the money is dispersed and the dividends to an NGO that spends that money on its purpose, which is protecting and restoring the living world. So it's possible for big companies to transform. If I say what's the stumbling block, and we're in the world of business, I think that for many major publicly shareholder owned companies, this is really hard, because when you're a publicly shareholder company, there's a particular design that you've got of your ownership, and therefore your finance and your governance. You're caught in the quarterly reports, you're caught on short-term thinking. And my question to them is how and if you're ever going to be able to transform and become regenerative. And in fact, at Deal, we spend a lot of our time working with small startups that are creating products that are transformative, clean energy, regenerative, circular economy, because we want to make sure that as much as they put energy and time into designing their products, they make sure they design their enterprise so they don't get captured and sold off to venture capital that then actually rubs out their purpose and mainstreams them. So it's that question of how do we redesign the deep design of institutions, and will that enable us to transform? That, I think, we're only beginning just now to do this work, right? And cities are just beginning. We're just getting going, and we're going to come up against the very big interests of the vested system, the wider economic system, the mainstream capitalism that's around us. How then, what will happen? And we don't yet know. This is an experiment. This is an experiment, and we are learning together.
On that point, are you able to name vested interests? So for example, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, it's still written that the 8th goal is to promote sustainable economic growth for all. So is this idea still stuck because it's just habit, or is there active resistance that you've come across? And can you name what those things are?
So certainly in the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 8 has that it's like the Trojan horse inside the social goals. And so when I show the sustainable development goals, I'm only showing the social priorities. That goal is not in the ones, it doesn't show up in the donut, and the donut actually is a major counter to the presumption of endless growth. It says, no, we need to learn to thrive. So the history around the SDGs, writing the SDGs, I remember they were being created at the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012, when the donut was actually first launched. And I know that originally there was the concept of planetary boundaries was there. And then as the finance ministers got closer and closer, and as the conference got closer and suddenly the big ministries starting turning up, I know there was a meeting where the finance minister of Brazil said, what's this planetary boundaries? That is a limit to our development. Take it out. Planetary boundaries were taken out. And this idea of growth gets put in. And it's not just growth for the low-income countries. And I profoundly believe that low-income countries like Malawi, like Bangladesh that I showed, their economies will and must and should grow. And that growth should be channeled into meeting the needs of all people. And then they will need to grow in regenerative ways. So I want to be very clear. I'm not against growth where it's needed so that we grow until we're grown up. But it's used as to meet the vested interests of all countries. So it's like a shield that all countries must grow. Now, that's because we're locked into the growth-centric paradigm of mainstream capitalism. We're locked into an economy where finance has been designed, and this takes me back to the work of Bernard Lietaer, finance has been designed with cumulative interest. So it assumes that this is its shape, that it will accumulate endlessly. And it's profound, because everything on this living planet, life deteriorates, potatoes rot, and newspapers rot, and human bodies die, and metal rusts. We are subject to the second law of thermodynamics. But money accumulates. It has compounding interest, and Fritz Schumacher knew that, and Aristotle knew that, and Marx knew that. And so the design of money means it's endlessly seeking its return. And it exploits and consumes the living world. It exploits and consumes the unpaid care of parents. It has a racial capitalism. It exploits Black and brown bodies in its name to drive that return. So there's the vested interest, and it shows up in the major fossil fuel companies that still are, well, today are raking in record profits, because they have for so long lobbied to first obfuscate and to delay action on climate change. I think it's in major companies that are driven by this shareholder return, and it's the power of the owners of capital, that they invest in protecting the power of the rentier economy. And then many governments are in service to this. And so I'm shocked, actually, that in my own country, both the leaders of the Conservative Party and the leader of the Labour Party recently have said the goal of our government would be growth, growth, growth. I mean, have we learned nothing on left and right in the UK? This is all we can imagine. This is the biggest vision that is being put forward now. It's extraordinary.
Well, that kind of goes to one of our other questions, which is that, of course, COP27 is underway right now. And you just mentioned how plenty of politicians are still locked into the growth mentality. And I wondered, and often that discourse is also zero sum, where if somebody gains something, somebody else is losing something. And I wondered if you've seen any politicians or leaders in the state realm that are able to get away from that discourse and talk more about balance and regeneration. Have you seen anybody been able to kind of translate the Doughnut Economics message and take it into the political realm successfully?
So I will say that when I haven't gone to COP for several years. I first went to a COP in 2006. It was held in Nairobi when I worked for Oxfam. And the COP being the conference of the parties, it's the UN, right? The world's governments getting together and trying to negotiate a climate accord, or not trying. I was really struck when I went to the COP in Nairobi that the only people who you could say were representing Indigenous interests, they were Maasai drummers, and they were entertaining us, playing the drums while we were drinking cocktails after the negotiations. There were no Indigenous representations of Indigenous voices. It was so shocking. And that was in 2006. Now, one good thing I'm going to say about the COP is that that has changed over the years, and that Indigenous leaders from around the world, from many different Indigenous cultures, now have voice. And I would say that they have always stood for a world of balance, a world that recognizes social and ecological balance. And they, as I showed at the beginning, many other cultures have this so deeply ingrained in their worldview, and the Doughnut is like a Western recovery program, helping us move towards what is deeply held in their cultures. I will say that I think New Zealand, because of the rich Maori cultural inheritance that's now beginning to be recognized and informs, for example, their living standards framework, it's much more based in an ecological understanding. Now, I'm not saying that means New Zealand's doing anything like as much as they should in the climate negotiations, but that's a country that has moved away from growth towards having a richer, more Indigenous informed framework. There's a group of countries called the Wellbeing Governments Alliance with Scotland and Iceland and Wales and New Zealand amongst them, actually. Interestingly, all with female leaders. What's going on? That's interesting. Who are saying, actually, let's stop trying to grow endlessly as the idea of success. Let's go and do something more interesting and aim to be well-being economies. So there's a movement there. And then I'm going to say that rather than, and also small island nations, I mean, that are literally about to be lost under the waves, they are calling against the endless growth. So they have spoken that very loudly for very many years. But I'm going to move away from the national politics, because the work that I'm experiencing, it's happening more often at the city level. And I think cities are a greater site for experimentation and a daring to move and transform your vision. So as I showed that map, that was 40 cities, districts, regions that are embracing the Doughnut and saying, well, we want to thrive, and this actually acts as a compass for us. And just this week, actually, the city of Copenhagen in Denmark, they are advertising to hire a Doughnut policy advisor. It's like an official, it's a real job in Copenhagen City Council. They're saying, we want to adopt the Doughnut model. We want to hire somebody to help us do this. It's exciting to me that these are real jobs being created inside governments. It's beginning to pop up. And of course, to repeat what I said, the power of peer-to-peer inspiration. When Amsterdam did it, you know, I can do a TED talk. I can talk about what if cities did this. It's a whole other thing when the mayor, deputy mayor of Amsterdam says, yeah, we're adopting the Doughnut because it makes sense and it enables us to pursue a transformative vision. Other city policymakers follow that and inspired by that. So we at Deal amplify those voices, and something's happening at the moment. It's taking off, and of course, crisis is often what means we turn. Crisis is an opportunity to turn. Okay, what? And I'll stop saying. Milton Friedman, I had this great quote that only a crisis, actual or perceived, creates real change. And he said, when it comes, people turn to the ideas that are lying around at the time, and that was his framework for thinking about seeding the ideas of neoliberalism from the 1940s, and they got picked up by Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s. Well, I'm going to take that same inspiration and say, yeah, when crisis comes, people will turn to the ideas that are lying around at the time. But why have them lying around? Why not have them up and running? Why not have them demonstrated in cities, in communities, in business? So the pioneers are beginning to put this into practice, so that when governments actually say, okay, then if not endless growth, because it's beginning to sound hollow and stupid, if not that, then what? And here is an alternative mindset that's actually up and running. That's one vision of a future that I'm working for.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of visions of the future, this might be more of a fun question, but are you much of a science fiction reader? And are there any books or movies that you have found inspiring that can lead us to a future world? We do have some students that are listening in, and they've talked about being frustrated about their current economics education. So I'm sure they're going to be excited to dig into all the other thinkers that you've mentioned that we can read about. But is there anything in the fiction?
Yes, well, I love the work of Ursula Le Guin. In fact, I read her book, The Dispossessed, 25 years ago, and just that idea of life on other planets with different ideas of ownership really hit me. Her short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, I recommend to everybody. And I'm currently reading Octavia Butler, And that's profound and disturbing, as it should be. And Kim Stanley Robinson, Ministry for the Future. That was a brilliant read, and a thrilling read. And I feel he's very close to, he obviously understands the politics and the context and his vision of one way of this going forward. And it's a story of success, but that's a hell of a bumpy road to success that he tells. A lot of the things, and he calls it the turbulent 20s. Well, here we are, we're in the turbulent 20s. This is it. And I really recommend that book. His other book, also Aurora, it's so profound. I couldn't get to the end because I found it so close to home. I've got to go back and read it.
Thanks.
But the power of science fiction, just to say, the power of science fiction, because it enables us to imagine other possible worlds. And in a way, these diagrams that I'm showing, and you could say heterodox economics, it's like science fiction. Is it science fiction economics? It's not made up. It's well, all models are made up, right? All diagrams and all models are made up. And it enables us to jump to other possible worlds. This is a world we can create where we respect the market and the state and the household and the commons, and we recognize them. And we teach students that language. And that's why I gave so much care to naming. You can be a steward and a co-creator and a parent and a carer. These are all roles we play. These are all parts of our identity. And fiction has the power to help us imagine futures that we don't have to live through, right? The brilliance of, I don't know, Victorian novels enable us to see relationships that we never want to be in, but we learn so much from their destructiveness. And I'd say Kim Stanley Robinson and other science fiction writers enables us to see future possible worlds that we really don't want to have to live through, and therefore we can learn to avoid them. Or they show us possible worlds that we could create. So it's incredibly powerful to use our imagination, and I think they play a very, very important role as part of the wider movement for transformation.
We have a lot of people writing in as students, or people asking about or talking about the importance of education and changing what we're teaching, which is something you talked a lot about. We have a question right here, a student at Yale School of the Environment who just took economics, and she asks, how do we inspire professors to shift from traditional economic theory? That might touch on your own story. I wonder if you have anything to share.
So everything about that question, hello, it's the person who asked that question. Everything about the question tells me she's probably just been taught traditional economic theory. And so I wrote Doughnut Economics. What motivated me to write it was like, right, I'm going to write the book that I wish I could have read when I was a student, that would have told me there's all these other worldviews that you can learn from. And my motivation, my focus was like, I want to help rewrite the economics that's taught in universities. Since it's come out, I mean, when it came out, the reception from academic economics departments is kind of like this. It's like, it's just like, ignore. It's a great tactic, by the way, for trying to make things go away. Ignore. They ignored it. The students didn't ignore it. So the students keep inviting me, but the academia ignored it. Now, other departments, universities, it's like development studies, open arms. This is home. Geography, welcome. Urban studies, politics, business schools. Business schools want it because business happens on a planet. Business is subject to climate breakdown. Business is subject to labor strikes and revolt, and business is subject to the dynamics of the world. So business schools wanted it, but economics departments, or oh yes, but maybe they've been, literally the aliens. They're doing very well. The aliens, yes. Oh, here's your living world. It's called an environmental externality. It's that little grey wedge. So, I'm not a combative person. I don't go on the attack. But there's something I have to say. There's something happened for me about the loss of Herman Daly, founding father of ecological economics. And all he asked is that every time you draw a box for the economy, just draw a circle around it and call it the world. It's obvious, but it's the most radical act in economics because it changes everything that follows. And I meet students today and I hear this question, and it's so clear to me that this still is not being taught. So I've shifted from being patient to actually I'm now impatient. And I'm wanting to work together with students in the Rethink Economics movement and in other movements, and to say, what now do we do? We can inspire professors. we can also demand of professors. I'm looking for other tactics. It's just time. It's time. And the problem is, students have got 3 years. They've also got exams. Professors have tenure. So this is a really unfair competition. And textbooks have republication dates. So students on this short-term rotation, and then they also come to a moment of, am I challenging the curriculum, or actually am I going to master it? Because I also want to pass my exam. I mean, I'm paying a lot of money to be here. So it's time for this transformation. I'm delighted to say that in our team at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we are literally in the process of hiring a schools and education lead. And I'm getting like more and more impatient and excited to come back to this and take this on again. We've got cities in action, we've got business in action, and I do believe that 21st century economics is going to be practiced first and theorized later, but the practice is now really getting underway. So let's get back working with the teachers, and they're amazing teachers. Here's to the teachers who do this anyway. Here's to the school teachers and the university teachers, and I know there's a lot of them. They send me slides and photos. I'm teaching. I put the donut in my macroeconomics class. I'm teaching it to my A-level students, my high school students. Thank you to those teachers. Let's get this into the curriculum. I will just say one thing, which what I was excited to see. So here's the International Baccalaureate. It's a international economics. This is Oxford University Press's International Baccalaureate edition. And it begins, I didn't make this happen. Somebody made this happen, it wasn't me. It begins with a chapter called The Evolution of Economics. And it starts with Adam Smith and it ends with the donut. Look, I've actually got in my hands an economics textbook that's got the donut in. Now the very next chapter goes, okay, now that was the donut. Now here's supply and demand. It kind of, but we're starting. So we cannot wait to work with the teachers and the students. And students, if you're interested in applying these ideas, on Deal's website, doughuteconomics.org, there is a tool for research. There's academic reports, but also research. And we're putting out all the dissertations that students have already done, using these tools. So you can learn from what others have already done. And you can say, I'm going to apply that in my place. I'm going to adapt it like this, do it like that. And we're going to be putting out research questions that we think would help this move forward. So we want to work with students who we know want to make their research useful. So we're just about to start building that community. Please join Deal as a member and you'll sign up to our newsletter. And when we're ready, that will happen really soon. My colleague, Andrew Fanning, our research and analysis lead, is going to be leading that. And we're about to get cooking.
That's so great to see it in a legitimate economics textbook.
Legitimate book, yes.
So we had some questions or some skepticism around people who are already comfortable with the way the world is. Maybe they're in a wealthier country or they have their ample means. And there's a quote that when you're accustomed to privilege, equality or balance feels like oppression. And someone asked the question of how can you liberate people from a fear of loss if they feel like this kind of system is going to be bad for them, even though it might be good for other people?
Well, that's a great question. That is a great question. And I'm not going to pretend to have an instant answer. I mean, having just come off talking about academic studies, a wonderful human psychology, cognitive study of what is all the evidence around that already shows us how best to describe possibility, or is it to inspire or persuade? I mean, all the different methods we have of enabling people to think about these things. I'll just speak a little bit. I was asked to contribute to Greta Thunberg's recent book. Where is it? Here it is. The climate book. I'm just thinking of this suddenly because I was asked to contribute a chapter on sustainable lifestyles at 1.5 degrees. And in doing so, I recognize, well, I'm one of these people this person just described. I mean, I live in a high income country. I live a comfortable life. So I live a life of privilege like many, many of us in this webinar do. How do we go about making adjustments in our lives? How do we recognize that we can change the way we eat? Like, what do we think is a normal diet? What do we think is a normal holiday, and how far should we travel? How do we heat our homes? Where do we save our money? How do we invest? How do we divest? How do we volunteer? How do we protest? And I went through the process with my partner. We have twins. And when our kids were very small, we got a car. And we called it Shevek, actually, after the character at the heart of Ursula Le Guin's book, The Dispossessed, since we mentioned her before. we got a secondhand car, and because I couldn't get around with these tiny babies any other way. And then when they were about 11, 12 years old, we said, well, we just can't justify that anymore because they bike everywhere. They can bike around. So it's time to get rid of the very nice convenience of having a car. And it's really convenient because actually, you know, one's going to a hockey match, got football on Sunday morning, and I can go and see my mum and dad. But you know what? We know too much. We know too much. How can we justify owning a private car? And we also live in a neighborhood. I live in East Oxford in the UK, where there's now the beginnings of a car sharing scheme where you can rent a car. So you join the club and you rent a car by the hour. And we just said, let's just do it. So I called up this car, let's have the car. I don't want to put the car out there and someone else to buy. I just want it to be removed from the roads. It's 11 years old. It was diesel, it should be gone. Its time is gone. So I called up this company, could you come and take the car away and dismantle it? And it'll all be 95% recycled. And the woman said, yeah, we'll come on, you know, the 3rd of January or something. And then she called back and said, no, we can't come to the 6th. And I was just like, just can't take it away already. This is really hard, because I kept sitting in it because I like the smell of it. It smells of family holidays. It smells of my kids when they were small. I would go on little drives around Oxford, like, oh, are we doing the right thing? It's just that thing just before change happens. That's the hardest moment, right? Change is hardest just before we make it. And eventually they turned up, this woman turned up, this massive flatbed truck, and she loaded our little car up on the back of it. And it went down the end of the road. And it was only when it turned the corner, it was out of sight. Only then, I just had this release. And there was this empty space in front of our house. And we brought some colored chalks and we immediately started chalking. It was like, don't somebody else to park their second car here. Just space. And I felt completely liberated. And I love being part of the car club. And yeah, it's slightly less convenient. And I have to book it in advance sometimes. But I share that car with other people and I'm part of sharing. So I'm telling this long story just because it's a really, and I wrote about it in this chapter in this book. It's a really personal experience of change can be hardest just before we make it. And then we can't imagine what we'll gain. We can only see what we think we'll lose. And I think that's just so true for many of the people who were just described about this, that they'll see balance and thriving in a more equitable world as loss. But actually, so many people would say, actually, I want my kids to be able to walk to school in clean air and it'd be safe. I don't want to live in a gated community where I'm spending money and waking night and fear and insecurity because of inequalities. So I don't have the answer, but I do know that change is hardest just before we make it, and we can come through the other side. And I think we will as societies, and say, why did that actually take us so long? Why did we want polluted lungs as we bike to school? So research, let's learn. This is a really great thing. We need to learn how to tell that story, to frame that narrative, to show possible futures that make people say, actually, I'm ready to make that change.
Yeah, and I mean, even if I can share this, when the Schumacher Center invited you to come speak, the original idea was to do an in-person event here in the Berkshires, and you responded that you've made a personal commitment not to fly. Can you talk a little bit about that? And actually, you know, there's a benefit to doing things in person, but look, now we have hundreds of participants able to join this conversation online, which may not have happened if we stuck to the old way.
Yes. So yeah, I just, my organization, when we set up Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we were going to be a little team together working in an office in Oxford. We began that way, and then COVID hit, and we suddenly said to our new recruits, don't come, and they were remote. And like so many organizations, we started working like this. Like I'm on Zoom. This is for me normal. I'm like this a lot of the time. This is how I work with my team. And it was at the time of Brexit. It was a time of Black Lives Matter. And it really made me think, I live in the city of Oxford, you know, it's one of the more expensive cities in the UK. I moved here because I worked for Oxfam and I stayed here. But why should anybody who wants to work for Doughnut Economics Action Lab live in the city of Oxford in Brexit Britain in the UK? Like, that's crazy. If we go online, look how many people can join. So my own life and organization has become part of that remote-based community, and it's opened up so many possibilities. Now we recruit people well, you know, in much wider time zones to our team. It's amazing. Same thing with this. When my book first came out, I traveled a lot, and my kids started saying, oh, but mum, you're always away. And I think, that's not what I want them to remember from me. And if I come to visit you, and it would have been lovely, and it would have been great to connect in person, but then I couldn't have actually done the talk to London School of Economics that I did actually on Friday night. And on Friday morning, I was giving a talk to some very wealthy family firms, and I couldn't have done that either. So actually, I'm able to talk with many more people, and we can have people from all over the world, and we can have a much richer conversation. You didn't have to have the means to show up in the institute in the Berkshires. So yeah, I've decided not to fly, and that's my commitment. I haven't said I will never ever fly again. My commitment is, for now, I'm working on the basis that I don't fly. Let's see how that goes. And let's see if anything ever comes up that I think that is so important, I will actually get on a plane for it. And so far, nothing's come up. And if we use these incredible tools to their potential and actually chat to each other and realize we can do so much, and I can wave bits of cardboard at you, and we can actually have a good time. So yeah, I'm not got rid of the car. I'm vegan. Not flying, and there's a wonderful website actually. If anybody thinks I kind of want to make these moves, there's a wonderful website called takethejump.org, and there's 6 things you can do if you want your life to be within a 1.5 degree protected climate world, and they include getting rid of your car, almost never flying, rarely buying new clothes. This I bought from, it's my favorite jumper, and I bought it from Oxfam. Only changing your phone once every 6 or 7 years. I got myself a Fairphone after 8 years, and I love my Fairphone. It's a ethical phone. Being vegan, did I say that one? And also acting. So acting to change the system. So move your money or change your engagement politically. So takethejump.org. I really recommend it to anyone who says, actually, I'm up for a challenge, and I know that change is hardest just before you make it.
Well, that was a great way to kind of bring it back home and bring it to the personal story. So I think we can wrap up now, and we want to thank you for being with us and sharing your thoughts. And we actually have a comment in the chat right now that says, "This is the most gratifying webinar I've ever attended." So I think that your words are very well appreciated, and we thank you so much. We also want to thank our sponsor for the lectures, the Christopher Reynolds Foundation. And all of you who are listening and participating in the chat and sharing questions. And I hope that we can all be connected by Zoom and other ways. So thank you.
Yes, and lots of people have been asking for the slides, and maybe they can ask further questions on social media. But I love the long format of this conversation, and that you were able to tell stories and not just share what you think, but why you think it, and how did you become the person that you are today? What was your evolution? Who inspired you along the way? So thank you for all of that.
Well, thank you so much. And actually, it's because it was for this lecture for Schumacher, and I've taught at Schumacher College in the UK, and it was really foundational for me as I came back towards economics. And with the death of Herman Daly, and it's a moment I'm finding myself really reflecting on, and gratitude for the ideas and the legacy of elders, and how the best way we can do respect to them is to put them into practice and to carry it forward. So thank you so much. It really means a lot to me to have done this lecture today with this honor. And here's to the legacy of our elders. May we do them justice.